Saul Kersh here with Double Alpha Academy, and in this video I'd like to show you the unboxing and the assembly and setup of your Double Alpha 550 mini case feeder. So the Double Alpha 550 mini case feeder comes including everything you'll need to set it up onto your 550 machine. It includes the parts required to convert the case feeder, not the press, but the case feeder between most pistol calibers, and will also enable you to do 223 and 300 blackout calibers as well. So let's see what's in the box and how we're going to set this up on our press. There are three main sub-assemblies. You have the magazine holder sub-assembly, which is already pre-attached and assembled to the plunger. You have the rail sub-assembly, which is the second piece, and you have the feeder sub-assembly, which has the assembly of parts which actually push and feed the cases into the shell plate. In addition, you have a replacement feeder slider. This is the one used for the rifle calibers, and you have a bag of orange translucent parts. These are the feeding tubes and the slider spaces used in the magazine holder for going between various pistol calibers. Plus you have one fully assembled magazine. This is the tube system that you will fill with the cases before you start. A couple of comments about this. I recommend that before you start filling them, you rotate the base so that it's in between holes. This way, when you fill the tubes, you don't have an open hole which will allow the cases to slide through. So you rotate that to the middle position, then you can easily fill these tubes. One other recommendation about these tubes is that we do offer the bowl solution. This is an add-on accessory. It is not included in the 550 mini case feeder, but this will make filling these tubes much quicker, and it comes including the adapter plate for the 223 caliber. So this is an accessory that's available that makes the tubes easier to fill. So the first thing to do, we're going to assemble this machine from the bottom up. There are three sub-assemblies. The lower one is the feeder sub-assembly, the middle one is the rail, and the upper one is the magazine holder, and we'll work our way through those pieces. Obviously you want to have your press empty, and it's a good idea to remove the tool head at this point. Just makes things a little easier to access. Now, one word of advice. If you have one of the latest versions of the Dillon 550, as this press body is here, it has a raised, polished, machined flange that fits around the tool head. Now this flange is a little higher than the press that we planned this part to fit onto, and we found that that ledge makes the fit of the rail just too tight. So what you'll want to do, if you have this raised shiny area around your tool head, you want to take your Dremel or a file and remove a little plastic from the clamp of the rail from the top side that fits over the machine, and just remove a millimeter and a half until about the level of the holes, and that will allow you to slide the rail all the way onto the body of the press. You do want to be able to push that rail all the way in so that the inside of the clamp area there is pushing up against the side of the machine. So if you have one of the latest presses which have this raised area here, just take your file to that area there before you start assembly. It'll make the fit much easier. So the first step of the assembly is to assemble the feed track of the 550 case feeder, and this piece assembles onto the base of the shell plate instead of the original roller bracket shell platform that's assembled on here. In order to get to that, you have to access two small Allen keys which are under the plate, and it's actually really hard to reach them when the machine is assembled. So what I like to do is I like to dismantle the shell plate platform, and that gives easy access to those screws. So we're going to do that real quick. Basically, you're going to bring the shell plate up a little bit, loosen that side screw, which locks the center bolt. Once that's loose, you can remove the main bolt. The little actuator fingers come right off, and the shell plate will come off. We'll remove the tabs. The ball and the spring, always handy to have a little magnet for this operation so you don't lose that ball. And get the ball and spring out using a little magnet is super easy. Now I have access to the bolts which hold the base of the shell plate or the platform. And once I've got these bolts out, the platform is loose. I can remove it, and this gives me access to the two screws that I want to have access to. These two here, which I can now remove in order to replace the original Dillon platform with our case feeding platform. While you have this piece in your hand, you also want to remove this little primer catcher here, because you will want to use that part on the 550 case feeder. So you just straighten and pull out that pin. This piece will not be in use. Using the same catcher that came off the Dillon press and pins, there you have that assembled. Now this piece does have a steel plate base on the bottom of it that gives it rigidity and strength. And we can reassemble the two original Dillon screws to hold that platform in place. Once that's done, I can now take this assembly and reposition it back onto the Dillon press. Now you could save this work of dismantling the platform, but honestly, accessing those two little screws on the bottom can be really tricky when it's assembled. It's a lot easier to do when you take it off first. Before you tighten these screws down, make sure that the platform is positioned correctly so that the primer punch fits into place, and then tighten them down. Once those are back in place, you can now assemble the rest of the parts that were removed of the shell plate. I'm going to return the spring and the ball, the shell plate itself, the piece that you actuate, with the little fingers on it. That goes into place next. And the main bolt. Okay, so now we have the feed track assembled and positioned in place. You will note that the feed track itself already includes its own roller, so you don't need to remove the roller from the Dillon part. The roller is assembled on our feed track as well. Next, we're going to assemble the rail. Now, the rail assembly mounts onto the side of the machine. There are two little set screws that will be used to lock this in place. You can expect those little set screw points to make small marks on the Dillon press. They might damage the blue paint just a little. There's no way around that. But once you assemble it in position, you shouldn't have to remove it. You shouldn't have to move that much. You're going to position the rail so that it is pressed up against the body of the machine. You don't want to have any gap there. There is a question of how far forward towards you, closer to the feeder track you're going to go. Don't push it all the way against the feeder track. It's important to note that the position of the rail, if you move it closer to the feeder track or further away, it will affect the range of motion that the actuator has. And you're going to use that to fine-tune the range if you find that the cases are not being pushed in far enough, or if you find that the roller is being pushed back too far and that the fork is being released on the back. That might mean you need to move the rail a little bit away. As a original setup, I'm going to have a gap of about 3-4 millimeters. In fact, my magnetic roller is not fully on the rail. I've got it set so that it's maybe 2/3 on the rail and the rest of it is kind of off the rail. I'm going to make sure that's nice and flush against the machine and tighten down these 2 set screws, which are available to access from the top. While you do that, hold the bracket in place so that it doesn't slide away out of position. Okay, once that rail is in place, the actuator is in fact functional. So as you slide the press up and down, you will see that the rail is now moving. The roller is sliding on the rail, and this is actuating the plunger in and out of its position. To finalize the assembly of the feed track, we will need to assemble the appropriate pipe and the funnel cap for the pipe. Now there are in fact 5 pipes which are included in the kit, and these 5 pipes are clearly marked with numbers and the calibers which they are designed for. The caliber affects the diameter of the inner pipe, but also the cutout that exists in the window in the front. Since we're setting up for 9mm at the moment, I'm going to take the one marked 9mm. It says 380 ACP to 9 and 921. There is a small tab in the front. This correlates with a cutout that exists in the top of the feed track assembly. This gives the correct orientation for this pipe. The orientation is important because the window cutout has to be facing the shell plate. So I'm going to orientate that correctly and make sure I slide it into place so that that tab clicks into its notch and the cap simply fits on top. Push that down. That's the funnel to ensure that the cases feed correctly. Now the magazine holder assembly arrives assembled with the cable and the plunger assembly. Now this mechanism is designed to feed one case from the magazine and above and drop it down into the tube, and this is actuated every time the tool head reaches the upper position. It is actuated by the center bolt in the tool head pressing on that plunger, which feeds one case across and drops it down into the awaiting funnel to top up the tube so that you can continue reloading. In order to assemble it, you simply remove the cap that it sits on top of the tube and slide the magazine into position. Now you might find that this is a very tight fit. If it is a tight fit for you, you can loosen the screws and use a screwdriver or an appropriate tool to pry open the bracket a little bit to make it easier to slide on. And you do need to slide it into position and down so that the steel rod protruding up from the clamp fits into the appropriate hole. It has a hole position, and that hole position slides down. The pipe, the tube slides into the hole, the steel rod slides into the hole until it sets into position. This gives it the correct height. Once you have that in place, you can tighten these screws, although it's hardly necessary, just to clamp it down and keep the orientation correct. Now, the actuator itself is designed to fit into the small hole that exists in the tool head. It fits in there quite loosely, and the tool head will slide into place. Now you'll note that on the bracket there's a steel rod protruding towards the center of the shell plate. Now that steel rod is there to hold the plunger in position. As you slide the tool head back into place, you're going to want to lift that little rod upwards so that it can fit over the indent that exists in that plastic part and slide it into position. Now every time the bolt or the shell plate rises to the upward position, the feeder is activated. And that basically concludes the assembly of the 550 mini case feeder. It's ready to use. One other thing, there is an adapter slider piece that fits into the magazine holder. Now that adapter piece, there are 3 of them, and they are marked with various calibers. If you're loading the longest possible case we can handle, which is the Rifle 223 or the 300 Blackout, you don't use any spacer. You use the full height of the shuttle here, and you don't use a spacer. If you're loading really long pistol calibers, 357, 38 special, you use the shortest one that we provide. And because we're loading 9mm, which is in fact the shortest case, we're going to use the 1 Mark 380 ACP or 9mm. Now this piece will slide on and click onto the lower frame right there. You'll see how it fits in there when you have a look. It locks into place and it compensates for the length when the case is dropped. That's important that that be set up correctly. Finally, I can return my tabs into the press. I can take my I've preloaded a set of tubes, just align the hole with the hole that exists in the magazine holder, seat it all the way down, and click one of the pipes into position so that the cases can drop. One other important setup, notice, you must make sure that your pipe is full of cases before you start running. You don't want to have an empty feed pipe in place because that will prevent the cases stacking, and you do want them stacked because they do support each other in the stack and make the case that's being fed out a lot more stable. If you try to run this machine when the pipe is empty, every time a case drops it'll fall all the way down to the shell plate. And that's not what you want, because when it hits there it bounces and it tends to fall sideways. But if it falls on top of a stack, that works fine and remains nice and stable. So make sure you fill that tube manually before you start, almost to the top, so that there's room just for the one case that will be fed when the mechanism asks for it. So this is now fully assembled and ready to load 9mm. It's important to note that obviously I'm not loading complete ammo here. This table is not stable enough to do that, and I haven't got my tool head complete, but I can cycle the machine and run the cases through. Everything is prepped and ready to go. As I bring the tool head up, the actuator is activated and a new piece of brass is filled into the pipe. As I index, on the upstroke the case is fed in. The extra case is added over here. And in this way, the 550 case feeder is working and is ready to run. A couple of words and recommendations about the operation of the machine. First, keep an eye on the tube that's going to be emptying out. You have 20, 25 pieces of cases depending on what caliber you're loading in each pipe. As you see it run empty, as you hear they stop dropping, rotate the pipe manually so you bring your next pipe above the hole and you can immediately continue to reload. The other thing is, don't be violent with the forward stroke of the handle. You don't want to knock over the case as you're pushing it into the shell plate. You want to operate the machine with a smooth stroke that will prevent any kind of feeding issues. The case, as it slides forward into the shell plate, is unsupported. It's just resting on a base which transitions into the press. If your stroke is smooth, there are no issues, and the mechanism will feed perfectly smoothly and allow you to keep your strong hand on the handle while reloading, and this in fact will double your output speed when loading on the 550.